They dragged him through miles of filth and left him hanging over a nest of venomous ants for days on end. The enemy thought they had broken him, but they didn't know that the human spirit is stronger than steel. Today, you will witness the unbelievable true story of US pilot Dieter Dengler, a survival struggle that will send shivers down your spine. This is the brutal reality of the Vietnam War, a conflict that spilled over into the sovereign lands of Laos. The US government, determined to cut off supply lines, turned the Laotian landscape into a graveyard of unexploded ordnance. Dieter Dengler, a US Navy pilot, was just a kid on his first mission when he flew too low, and the enemy took notice. A single, well-placed shot shredded his aircraft's wing, sending him spiraling into the dense, suffocating jungle. He survived the crash, but in this ocean of green, he was invisible. He sent out signals, yet he was nothing more than a needle in a haystack. He had been trained to survive the wilderness, but no amount of SEER school could prepare a man for the moment 12 AK-47s are leveled at his face. The local guerrillas didn't just capture him. They broke him. They dragged him by a rope around his neck, parading him toward their village like a trophy. His training whispered to him, "Stay calm, smile, be cooperative." But reality was colder. They toyed with him, firing rounds inches from his ears just to watch him jump, leaving him deafened and disoriented. By morning, he was shoved into a truck and hauled before a governor. He was offered a deal. Sign a confession admitting to war crimes and pinning the deaths of innocents on the American military, and he'd be free in 2 weeks. Dengler refused. He stood his ground, stating his orders were to hit military targets, not civilians. The governor's eyes turned stone cold. He told him that he had chosen his own hell, and that even God couldn't save him now. What followed was a nightmare of systematic torture. They denied him sleep, dunking his head into water the moment his eyes grew heavy. Eventually, he was thrown into a dilapidated hut, his new, miserable prison. He realized quickly he wasn't the only ghost here. A voice emerged from the darkness, a fellow prisoner whispering an urgent command. "Stay quiet. They're coming." With those words, his captors returned, binding his ankles to heavy, jagged logs to ensure he couldn't run. The next morning, he was pushed out into the light, and the true horror of the camp was revealed. The other prisoners were gaunt, walking skeletons, their ribs pushing against papery skin, victims of malnutrition and pure neglect. A prisoner named Jean introduced him to the others. By day, they were allowed to roam the camp, but the perimeter was a death sentence. Step too close and the guards would put a bullet in your brain without a second thought. To Dengler, this place felt different. There were no iron bars or concrete walls, just the sprawling, unforgiving jungle. He started to believe escape was possible, but he failed to ask the one question that mattered. If it was truly that easy, why had nobody left? Jean believed the war would end and they would be released. But when Dengler crushed that hope by revealing the war was still raging, the light in Jean's eyes simply died. He had spent 2.5 years holding on to a lie, and now the truth was the sharpest blade of all. Dengler was convinced that freedom was within his grasp, and he was determined to make his move that very night. But Jean cut him short, his voice trembling with a terrifying reality. "If you bolt and get caught, these guards will make us all pay, and our slim chance of ever going home will vanish forever." The others chimed in with a chorus of defeat. A prisoner named Dwayne laid it out plain. "This hut isn't your prison. The jungle is. Even if you slip past the guards, you won't last 2 days without food or water in this green hell." Dengler didn't blink. "Then we run during the monsoon," he countered. "We'll have more than enough water." But the crushing blow came next. The monsoon was still 4 months away. Dengler realized that the more he asked, the more excuses he'd get, so he decided to force the issue. He insisted he'd go at night, but the other prisoners just stared at him with pity. They knew what he didn't. The guards weren't fools. They shackled every prisoner's hands and feet before they slept. When Dengler asked for a nail to pick the lock, they laughed. The entire camp was made of bamboo and reeds. Iron was as scarce as hope. But one prisoner whispered that he knew where a nail was hidden, driven into a bamboo post right where the small guard sat. Jean pleaded with him, begging him not to risk their lives for a suicide mission, but Dengler was deaf to the fear. He orchestrated a distraction, and while the guards were busy dealing with the chaos, Dengler slipped toward the post, snatched the nail, and filed it down into a makeshift tool. That night, under the cover of darkness, he spat the nail out of his mouth and, with the precision of a master, clicked his handcuffs open. The sound was softer than a whisper, but to the other men, it sounded like a miracle. They gathered around, stunned, as he showed them the trick, a simple nudge of the internal spring. But the next day, reality slammed back into them. An American aircraft roared overhead, sending the guards into a frenzy. In the chaos, a guard fired, grazing Dwayne's skin, a sharp reminder that death was always an inch away. Later, a guard stormed in, shoved his rifle into Dengler's chest, and mocked him, demanding he beg for his life. Dengler played the part, only to realize the rifle was empty. The guard was just toying with his fear. That night, starving and hollow, the men stared at a magazine clipping of food pinned to the wall, haunted by the memory of a world where they didn't have to fight to survive. Then the sky broke. A massive storm rolled in, the perfect cover. Dengler knew this was it, but Gene stood in his way, stubborn and terrified, warning him that if he made a move, he'd scream and alert the entire camp. Dwayne looked at Dengler and knew the truth. The war wasn't ending. If it were, they wouldn't be building new guard towers out of fresh-cut bamboo. Dengler begged them to come along, to choose freedom over a slow, agonizing death. But Gene's fear was a cage of its own. Faced with the threat of being betrayed by their own comrade, Dengler was forced to stand down. They had one shot at this, and they couldn't risk it all on a gamble that would end in a massacre. The following days were a test of pure endurance. The guards were on edge, tightening their grip, even reprimanding the young, dim-witted guard for letting his rifle slip for just a second. As the rotations shifted, the camp fell under the control of inexperienced men, dangerous fools who played with the prisoners' lives like toys. To stay alive, Dengler was reduced to scavenging every single grain of rice and eating whatever insects he could find. It was the only thing standing between him and the skeletal decay of the other men. Gene asked why he was hoarding rice, and when Dengler revealed his plan to escape, Gene begged him to stop, terrified of the retaliation. But Dengler had been observing. Every afternoon, the guards left their weapons unguarded outside the kitchen. It was a consistent, daily ritual. His plan was simple: slip out, seize the rifles, take control of the camp, and signal for rescue. He began marking guard positions daily with a piece of mirror, creating a map of their movements in his mind. Even the young guard, the only one with a hint of humanity left in his eyes, occasionally slipped Dengler extra rice. But survival was a game of inches. While marking positions, Dengler was nearly caught, narrowly playing it off as a game. Night after night, they worked in the dark, picking their shackles and gnawing away at the bamboo floorboards beneath their hut to carve an exit. Crawling into the crawl space, Dengler tested the perimeter fence. It was weaker than they'd prayed for. The window of opportunity was opening. He told Dwayne and the others that with the monsoon a week away, it was now or never. Gene, however, was a constant anchor of fear. Dengler reached his breaking point. He would rather die trying than rot in that hut. Tensions boiled over when the camp's food supply hit rock bottom. The bombs had scorched the earth, and even the guards were starving. When Gene reached for the rice Dengler had saved for the escape, Dengler refused. He left Gene shackled that night to prevent any interference, fueling a bitter rift between them. Though he apologized the next day, the camaraderie was fraying. The situation turned dire when an American plane flew over. The guards, paranoid that the prisoners were signaling, brutalized them. Dwayne broke down completely, his spirit shattered, but Dengler held him together. Then came the chilling revelation. One prisoner, who understood the guards' language, overheard them discussing the food shortage. The guards weren't just hungry. They were planning to march the prisoners into the jungle and execute them, framing it as an escape attempt. They were out of time. The next day, the guards moved toward the kitchen, leaving their weapons behind. Dengler lunged, grabbing every rifle he could carry and rushing back to arm his men. He reached the rally point, breath hitching, waiting for the others, but they didn't show. Outnumbered by 6 guards and forced into a corner, Dengler had to act. He opened fire, taking out the guards in a desperate, violent surge. He screamed for Gene, but the silence told him everything. He had been betrayed. He spared the young guard who had once shown him mercy and fled into the jungle with Dwayne. Moments later, they stumbled upon Gene, who stood there like a ghost, acting as if he hadn't just sent them to their deaths. Dengler, fueled by a mixture of fury and shock, demanded to know why they had been abandoned. When he looked at Gene's feet, he saw the ultimate insult. The boots that belonged to him and Dwayne were gone, and Gene, lying to the very end, claimed his friend had taken them. Dengler realized the man was drifting into madness, and if he wanted to survive, he had to cut the cord. After a grueling negotiation, he traded his ammunition for a secondary knife and left Jean to his own fate, pressing on through the brush with Dwayne. Soon, Dwayne looked up at the darkening sky and whispered that the rains were coming. A blessing, as it finally meant fresh water. They opened their precious pouch of rice, savoring every single grain, but the ground they sat on was already treacherous. A sudden, violent surge of mud and debris swept through, washing their meager rations away and leaving them with nothing. They had to find food or they would perish. Following a river toward the promise of Thailand, they lashed together bamboo to build a raft, but the river had a cruel surprise. The current surged, pulling them toward a massive, hidden waterfall. They scrambled to the shore just seconds before the drop, watching their raft vanish into the abyss. They were trapped, shattered, and had no strength left to build another. Stripping off his shirt, Dangler found his body covered in leeches. He pulled them off one by one, the desperation so absolute that he briefly considered eating them just to quiet his starving stomach, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Broken by bone-deep fatigue, they buried themselves in leaves and succumbed to a fitful sleep. By morning, they spotted a fisherman in the distance. They tracked him, hoping for a scrap of food, but their rifles were now dead weight. The noise of a shot would only reveal their location to the enemy, and the steel was too heavy to carry. They cast the weapons aside, walking forward with empty hands and hollow spirits. Dwayne was failing. The pain had moved beyond physical exhaustion, it was absolute. In a set of abandoned huts, Dwayne finally hit his limit. He begged Dangler to leave him behind, to let him find peace in death. But Dangler refused. He ignited a spark of hope, painting golden, vivid pictures of the life that awaited them once they made it out. It was that dream alone that kept Dwayne's heart beating. Just then, a helicopter roared overhead. Dangler screamed until his voice cracked, but the pilot didn't look down. The cold began to claw at Dwayne's mind, and he started hallucinating, begging Dangler to whisper so the guards wouldn't hear them. Dangler, desperate to be seen, promised to set the world on fire. The next day, friction started a blaze that roared through the dry timber, turning the jungle into a signal pyre. When the choppers returned, they didn't see an American pilot, they saw an enemy target. They opened fire, and Dangler barely crawled to safety, inches from death. When Dwayne finally woke, he was little more than a ghost. He looked at the charred forest and knew the villagers would be hunting for the source of the fire. They forced their broken bodies onward, stumbling until they found a young boy carrying water. They begged, hands clasped in prayer, but the boy screamed, summoning a mob. They surrendered, but mercy was nowhere to be found. The villagers drove a blade into Dwayne's leg, and before he could cry out, another man ended his life with a strike to the throat. Something in Dangler snapped. He lunged at them with a primal, terrifying roar, and the villagers, blinded by shock, scattered. Dangler dove into the dense undergrowth and vanished before they could circle back. That night, hiding in the dark, the silence was pierced by the ghost of Dwayne's voice, a haunting echo of the friend he had fought so desperately to save. His mind playing tricks as he drifted in and out of consciousness. One day, while stalking a group of enemy soldiers, he waited until they moved on, then scavenged their campsite like an animal, devouring their leftovers to silence the roar of his hunger. But the starvation was deep-seated. His body was shutting down, racked by vitamin deficiencies and hallucinations. He kept seeing Dwayne, shivering, whispering about the cold, only to turn and find nothing but empty, suffocating jungle. Desperation pushed him to the banks of a river, where he caught a non-venomous water snake. With nothing left to lose, he tore into it with his teeth, consuming it raw. Just as he was finishing, the unmistakable thrum of an aircraft vibrated in his chest. He grabbed a massive leaf, waving it frantically, screaming until his throat bled. The aircraft circled once, then twice. They had seen him. Hope, which had long since turned to ash, flickered back to life. A helicopter descended, a rope snaking down toward him like a lifeline. He grabbed it, his knuckles white with the desperate need to live. But as he was hauled upward, the jungle erupted. Enemy soldiers had spotted him and unleashed a hail of gunfire, trying to pull him back into the abyss. American cover fire drove them back, and finally, Dieter Dangler was pulled into the safety of the sky. Verification was a blur. His memories were fractured, his mind a scarred map of trauma, but he held on until he provided enough clarity to confirm his identity. He was home, but the transition was brutal. CIA officers immediately intercepted him, locking him away for interrogation under the veil of a highly classified mission. He was a piece of intelligence, not a man. But his friends wouldn't let him fade away. They stormed the hospital, carrying a birthday cake as a pretense to see him. And when the guards gave them 10 minutes, they didn't just share a meal. They staged a rescue. They hid him on a trolley, spirited him past the bureaucrats, and brought him to a waiting ship. As the crew cheered, Dengler finally smiled. A smile that held the weight of a ghost who had returned from the grave. Yet, the joy was hollow. The men he left behind in that bamboo prison were never saved. The final tally of his nightmare was stark. 6 months in that camp, and 23 days of pure, agonizing survival in the jungle, eating snakes and insects just to see another dawn. He was eventually retired from active duty, continuing his career as a civilian test pilot, and remarkably, he survived 4 more plane crashes in his lifetime, finally passing away in 2001. His story remains a haunting footnote to a war that scarred the Earth itself. Over 9 years, the US dropped 2.7 million tons of bombs on Laos, 800,000 of which never detonated. Today, the country remains the most heavily bombed in human history, a landscape still littered with active landmines that experts estimate will take another century to clear. Dieter Dengler's journey ended, but the ground he walked on is still a graveyard.